A child's world can shatter in an instant. And for one little boy, it did the moment he saw her push him over the edge. What unfolded next would leave anyone breathless. The sun hung low, its amber fingers brushing the surface of the river that wound through Sacramento, California. Golden light danced on the water, a serene mirror reflecting the calm of the evening. It was the kind of night where time seemed to pause, too perfect, too still, as though nothing could disturb its quiet grace. On the old stone bridge, a place cherished by locals for solitude and reflection, two figures stood. Their forms were silhouetted against the fading glow of the horizon, stark outlines etched into the dusk. Elliot Harmon, a man deep into his 7th decade, leaned heavily against the railing. His tailored jacket spoke of wealth, his polished shoes whispered privilege. But his posture betrayed him, a slight stoop, the weight of years pressing down. Elliot had earned admiration as a benefactor, funding schools, shelters, and countless causes. Yet whispers followed him like shadows, arrogance, sharp words, reminders of debts owed. Beside him stood a woman, younger, perhaps in her early 40s. Her auburn hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, framing a face adorned with a polite smile. Lorraine, one of Elliot's closest confidants, or so he believed. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, not truly. To an outsider, they might have appeared as friends sharing a casual conversation. But beneath the surface, tension simmered, unseen but palpable. Elliot's voice began calm, almost conversational, but grew sharper with each passing word. "You don't think I know what's been going on, Lorraine," he said, gesturing with his hands. "You can't keep these things hidden forever." His tone carried an edge, sharp enough to make her grip her handbag tighter. She tilted her head slightly, her reply dripping with forced patience. "You've always been so paranoid, Elliot. Maybe it's the age catching up with you." Below them, the river flowed silently, indifferent to the storm brewing above. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, their songs the last echoes of daylight. Nature itself seemed oblivious to the unease crackling between the two figures on the bridge. Unbeknownst to them, someone else watched. Hidden among the tall reeds along the riverbank sat Theo, a 9-year-old boy with wide, curious eyes. He often came here after school, letting his imagination roam free in this secret sanctuary. But today, his gaze drifted upward, drawn to the pair atop the bridge. Something about their stance, the rise and fall of their voices, made his stomach churn. Lorraine's polite facade crumbled, replaced by a steely resolve. Elliot, lost in his tirade, failed to notice the shift. "You think I won't do anything about it? I've dealt with people like you before," he spat. Theo couldn't hear every word, but the tone told him enough. He sank deeper into the reeds, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The tranquility of the evening shattered when the argument took a darker turn. Elliot stepped closer, his voice dropping but retaining its venomous bite. "You've used me, haven't you? All the trust, the opportunities one gave you, it's all been a game." Lorraine's knuckles whitened around her handbag. Her voice turned icy, detached. "You don't understand. You think your money makes you invincible? That it gives you the right to control people? You're just an old man who can't see what's right in front of him." Elliot's laugh was bitter, hollow. "And what's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze flickered toward the edge of the bridge. Her expression hardened, unreadable. Elliot's voice softened, sensing something amiss. "Lorraine, whatever you think you're doing." He never finished. In a flash, Lorraine lunged forward, shoving him with both hands. Elliot's cry was brief, swallowed by the rush of cold water as his body tumbled over the railing. The sound of impact was muffled, devoured by the river's relentless current. Lorraine froze, her hands still outstretched, disbelief etched across her face. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. For a moment, she simply stared at the water, waiting for him to resurface. But he didn't. Panic clawed at her throat as her eyes darted to the empty path behind her. No one. No witnesses. With trembling fingers, she smoothed her coat and adjusted her handbag. Taking a shaky breath, she turned and walked away, heels clicking against the stone bridge, leaving no trace of what had transpired. But she had underestimated the boy hiding in the reeds. Theo watched it all unfold, his breath caught in his throat. He clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle a gasp, his mind racing to process the horror before him. Elliot's body briefly surfaced, arms flailing weakly against the current. He wasn't moving toward the shore. He wasn't moving at all. Theo's first instinct screamed at him to run. This wasn't his problem. He was just a kid. But something held him there. Perhaps it was the memory of his own grandfather who had taught him to fish in this very river. Or maybe it was the faint, desperate sound of Elliot's struggle. Whatever it was, Theo knew he couldn't walk away. Heart pounding, he stepped out from behind the reeds. Glancing toward the bridge, half expecting to see Lorraine staring back, he found only emptiness. The path was clear, save for Elliot, now fighting a losing battle with the water below. The boy's small hands trembled as he scanned the area. No one else was around. "Hey!" Theo shouted, his voice cracking with fear and urgency. "Hey, can you hear me?" Elliot barely turned his head, his strength fading fast as the current dragged him farther from the bridge. Theo's chest tightened. The man wouldn't make it on his own. Kicking off his sneakers, he waded into the river, the icy water biting at his legs. It was colder than he'd imagined, each step stealing his breath. "Hold on," he yelled, trying to steady his voice despite the panic surging within him. But the river showed no mercy. Elliot's head slipped beneath the surface, and terror gripped Theo's veins. Stumbling back onto the bank, he searched wildly for something, anything, that could help. His eyes landed on a thick branch wedged against a boulder nearby. Scrambling toward it, he grunted as he yanked it free. The wood was heavier than expected, but sturdy. Dragging it to the water's edge, he shoved it as far into the river as he could. "Grab this," he shouted, his voice echoing against the quiet surroundings. Elliot's hand broke the surface, grasping weakly at the air. Theo stepped deeper into the river, the current pushing hard against his small frame. The cold seeped into his bones, but he refused to stop. "Come on," he yelled, desperation fueling his determination. Finally, Elliot's fingers found the branch, but they slipped, unable to hold on. "No, no! Don't let go!" Theo cried, summoning every ounce of strength he possessed. Elliot latched on, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Theo dug his heels into the muddy ground and pulled, the current resisting with brutal force. His arms burned, his legs shook, but he gritted his teeth and tugged with everything he had. Almost there, he panted, inching backward toward the shore. Elliot's body scraped against the rocks as the boy dragged him closer. When Theo finally collapsed onto the bank, Elliot lay beside him, gasping for air. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but he was alive. The distant wail of sirens pierced the silence, growing louder with each passing second. Relief washed over Theo as he realized help was on the way. But he wasn't done yet. Kneeling beside Elliot, he shook his shoulder gently. "Stay awake," he pleaded. "They're almost here." Elliot's eyes fluttered open, his breathing ragged, his lips blue from the cold. His voice was barely a whisper. "Who are you?" Theo leaned closer, his own breaths coming in sharp gasps. "My name is Theo," he said quickly, his teeth chattering. "I saw what happened. You're gonna be okay. Help is coming." The sirens grew louder now, their wails slicing through the stillness of the trees. But Elliot's body trembled violently, and Theo wasn't sure if he could hold on until the paramedics arrived. He grabbed Elliot's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Don't go to sleep, okay? Stay awake. You hear me?" Elliot blinked slowly, his head rolling to the side. Theo's stomach twisted into knots. What if he didn't make it? What if the ambulance didn't come in time? The boy jumped to his feet, his socks soaked and caked with mud. He ran to the edge of the road, waving his arms frantically as a police car screeched to a halt. "Over here!" Theo yelled, his voice cracking under the strain. Two officers stepped out, followed closely by paramedics carrying a stretcher. Theo led them to the riverbank, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "He fell. No, he was pushed into the river. I pulled him out, but he's really cold, and I think he hit his head or something." The paramedics sprang into action, wrapping Elliot in a thermal blanket and checking his vitals. One of the officers turned to Theo, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "You pulled him out of the river, by yourself?" Theo nodded, still trying to catch his breath. "I didn't know what else to do." The officer crouched down, looking Theo squarely in the eye. "That was incredibly brave, son. You probably saved his life." Theo glanced at Elliot, who was being loaded onto the stretcher. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of pride. But the weight of what he'd seen, the truth he carried, still pressed heavily on his mind. As the paramedics carried Elliot toward the ambulance, Theo tugged on the officer's sleeve. "The woman," he said, his voice shaking. "The one who was with him, she pushed him. I saw it." The officer's expression hardened. "Are you sure?" Theo nodded, his heart pounding like a drum. "I saw her do it. She walked away after." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before pulling out a notepad. "Can you describe her? Anything you remember will help." Theo hesitated, his mind racing back to that moment on the bridge. He described her auburn hair, her coat, the way she looked so calm as she walked away. The officer jotted it all down, his jaw tightening with every detail. But as the ambulance doors closed and the flashing lights disappeared down the road, Theo couldn't shake the thought. What if the woman got away before they found her? The hours that followed felt like a blur to Theo. The officers took his statement while paramedics examined him for signs of hypothermia. Wrapped in a scratchy blanket and sipping from a steaming cup of cocoa someone had handed him, he kept replaying the scene in his head, the push, the struggle, the rescue. At the hospital, Elliot was stabilized and placed under observation. The doctors assured everyone he would recover, though it would take time. Theo's mother, who had arrived in a panic after being contacted by the police, hugged him tightly, her tears dampening his hair. "What you did was incredible," she whispered. "You're so brave." The next day, the story hit the local news. 9-year-old saves wealthy philanthropist from near death in river flashed across screens, accompanied by a blurry photo of Theo standing on the riverbank, still soaked and shivering but alive. His name spread through the community like wildfire, earning him praise from strangers and neighbors alike. But Theo wasn't basking in the attention. As reporters gathered on his front lawn, his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman. Did the police find her? Was she still out there, walking free? The answer came 2 days later when an officer knocked on their door. Theo and his mother opened it together, his heart pounding. The officer smiled faintly. "We got her," he said simply. Theo blinked. "You found her?" The officer nodded. "Your description was spot on. We traced her back to a nearby hotel. She was trying to leave town when we caught her." Relief washed over Theo like a wave, but it was quickly followed by something else, anger. "Why did she do it?" he asked. The officer sighed, shifting his weight. "That's what we're still piecing together. Looks like she had been working for Mr. Harmon for years, but there were some financial disputes. She claims he was going to ruin her, and she acted out of desperation. That'll all come out in court." Theo swallowed hard, his small hands curling into fists. "She just left him there," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "She didn't even look back." The officer crouched down to Theo's level. "And you didn't leave him. You stayed. You saved him. Don't forget that." Theo nodded, but his mind was heavy. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a kid who had seen too much. But as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he realized something important. He had done what he could. The courtroom was packed the day Lorraine was brought to trial. Theo sat quietly with his mother in the back row, his small frame dwarfed by the wooden bench. He didn't understand much of the legal jargon, but he understood the looks on the faces around him, shock, anger, and a faint whisper of disbelief that someone could do what she had done. When it was his turn to testify, Theo felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room as he walked to the stand. His hands trembled slightly as he recounted what he had seen on the bridge that evening. His voice was steady, though, and when he described how she had walked away without hesitation, an audible gasp rippled through the courtroom. Elliot was there, sitting in a wheelchair at the front of the room. His injuries had left him frilier than before, but his presence was a silent testament to Theo's courage. Their eyes met briefly as Theo finished his testimony, and in that moment, Elliot gave him a small nod of gratitude. The trial ended with Lorraine's conviction. As she was led out in handcuffs, Theo watched her face. She didn't look at him or anyone else. Her expression was blank, unreadable. For the first time since the incident, Theo felt a strange sense of closure. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal, though Theo's world had been forever changed. Strangers stopped him on the street to shake his hand. The mayor gave him an award for bravery at a small ceremony in the town hall, where Elliot, now fully recovered, stood beside him. Elliot, once known for his sharp tongue and arrogance, had softened. He spoke publicly about the boy who had saved his life, calling him a true hero and promising to fund programs to support young people in the community. He even visited Theo's school one day, surprising the boy with a scholarship fund in his name. But for Theo, the biggest reward wasn't the recognition or the awards. It was the quiet knowledge that he had done the right thing, that when it mattered most, he hadn't turned away. Sitting by the river one evening, Theo thought about everything that had happened. He realized that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting, even when fear threatened to stop you. And sometimes, it was the smallest among us who could make the biggest difference. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Theo smiled to himself. He may have been just a kid, but in that moment, he felt stronger than ever. Stories like Theo's remind us that even in the face of fear and uncertainty, choosing to act can change everything. Courage is not defined by age or size, but by the strength to do what's right when it matters most.